The morning fog clings to Pearl Harbor like a shroud as Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey peers through his periscope at the Japanese merchant convoy steaming toward Formosa. It's March 1945, and the USS Barb sits motionless 60 feet below the surface, her crew of 80 men holding their breath in perfect silence. Above them, 4 enemy destroyers prowl the waters like hunting wolves, their sonar pinging through the darkness. Fluckey adjusts the periscope's focus, counting the targets. 7 cargo ships loaded with supplies for Japan's crumbling empire. Fuel, ammunition, food, medicine, everything the Japanese war machine desperately needs to continue fighting. His finger hovers over the firing control as sweat drips down his face in the stifling submarine heat. But here's what makes this moment absolutely extraordinary. This isn't just another submarine patrol. This is the climax of the most devastating naval campaign in military history. A 3-year underwater war that strangled an entire empire and brought Japan to its knees before the atomic bombs ever fell. Most people think World War II in the Pacific was won by aircraft carriers and Marines storming beaches. They're wrong. The real war, the war that actually decided everything, was fought in the crushing depths of the Pacific by men who volunteered for the most dangerous duty in the American military. Picture this. At the start of the war, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. 6,000 miles of conquered territory defended by the world's most powerful navy. Their merchant fleet of over 6 million tons carried the raw materials that fed their war machine: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaysia, iron from China, rice from Korea. Japan was a fortress supplied by an endless stream of cargo ships. The Japanese thought they were untouchable. Their surface fleet had humiliated the British at Singapore and crushed the Americans at Pearl Harbor. Their aircraft dominated the skies from Wake Island to the Philippines. They had every reason to believe their Pacific empire would last 1,000 years. They had no idea that beneath the waves, a small force of American submarines was about to methodically destroy everything they'd built. When Admiral Chester Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, he inherited exactly 51 operational submarines. 51 boats to take on the entire Japanese empire. The Japanese had over 400 warships, thousands of aircraft, and millions of troops. The math seemed impossible, but Nimitz understood something the Japanese didn't. Wars aren't won by conquering territory. They're won by destroying your enemy's ability to fight. And Japan's ability to fight depended entirely on those merchant ships carrying supplies across the Pacific. Cut those supply lines, and the mighty Japanese empire becomes a collection of isolated islands, slowly starving to death. The problem was American submarines in 1941 were a disaster waiting to happen. Their torpedoes were defective, exploding prematurely or failing to detonate at all. Their commanders were trained for World War I tactics that had no relevance to Pacific warfare. Their doctrine emphasized following international law over sinking enemy ships. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton of the USS Wahoo changed everything. On his first patrol in January 1943, Morton threw out the rulebook and began hunting Japanese ships like a predator stalking prey. He surfaced at night to attack convoys with deck guns. He pursued damaged ships relentlessly. He machine-gunned survivors in the water, breaking every rule of civilized warfare. His crew was horrified at first. This wasn't the clean, honorable combat they'd trained for. This was something darker, more brutal. But when the Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor flying a broom from her periscope, signaling a clean sweep of enemy ships, everything changed. Morton's success proved that submarine warfare in the Pacific wasn't about honor or rules. It was about killing Japanese ships as efficiently as possible. And the most efficient way to do that was to abandon every principle of civilized combat and fight like pirates. Within months, American submarine commanders across the Pacific were adopting Morton's ruthless tactics. They learned to attack at night when their radar gave them an overwhelming advantage. They discovered that Japanese anti-submarine warfare was primitive compared to German U-boat hunters. Most importantly, they realized that the vast Pacific Ocean was actually perfect hunting ground for submarines willing to operate without mercy. The Japanese never saw it coming. Their merchant captains had sailed these routes for decades without serious threat. Their naval escorts were designed to fight surface ships, not hunt submarines. Their anti-submarine technology was years behind American radar and sonar systems. Commander Richard O'Kane of the USS Tang perfected the art of night surface attacks, using his submarine speed and maneuverability to devastating effect. In one patrol, he sank 10 Japanese ships in 18 days, destroying over 39,000 tons of shipping. The Japanese called him the Ghost of the Pacific because his attacks seemed to come from nowhere. But the real breakthrough came when American submarines began coordinating their attacks. Instead of operating alone, they formed Wolfpacks that could track and destroy entire convoys. 3 or 4 submarines working together could eliminate a dozen merchant ships in a single night, leaving the ocean littered with burning wreckage and Japanese survivors. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant sailors was devastating. Men who had spent their lives carrying cargo across peaceful seas suddenly found themselves targets in a war they barely understood. Ships that left port never arrived at their destinations. Convoys that should have taken a week to cross the Pacific disappeared without a trace. Japanese cargo capacity began dropping at an alarming rate. In 1942, they lost 1.2 million tons of shipping. In 1943, that number doubled to 2.4 million tons. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japan could build them. The strangling of Japan had begun. Commander Samuel Dealey of the USS Barb took submarine warfare to its logical extreme. He didn't just hunt merchant ships. He hunted the destroyers sent to protect them. In one legendary patrol, he sank 5 Japanese destroyers in 4 days, proving that American submarines could take on Japan's most powerful warships and win. The Japanese Admiralty was in panic. Their merchant fleet was hemorrhaging ships at an unsustainable rate. Their destroyer forces were being decimated by submarines they couldn't catch. Their supply lines to the conquered territories were breaking down completely. But the Americans were just getting started. New submarines were rolling off assembly lines in record numbers. Advanced radar and sonar systems gave them unprecedented tactical advantages. Most importantly, they had developed a generation of submarine commanders who understood that winning meant abandoning every rule of civilized warfare. The Japanese Empire was about to discover that their island fortress was only as strong as the ships that supplied it. And those ships were being systematically hunted to extinction by American submarines operating with ruthless efficiency in the vast darkness of the Pacific Ocean. What happened next would transform submarine warfare forever and bring the Japanese Empire to the brink of total collapse. The underwater hunters were about to become the apex predators of the Pacific War. The numbers tell a story that even the most optimistic Japanese admiral couldn't ignore. By late 1944, American submarines had sunk over 4 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to destroying every cargo ship that entered American ports for an entire year. Japan's industrial production was collapsing not from bombing, but from starvation. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage of the USS Barb understood the mathematics of empire destruction better than most. On a sweltering August night in 1944, he surfaced his submarine in the middle of a Japanese convoy and proceeded to conduct what can only be described as maritime murder. For over an hour, the Barb raced through the convoy at flank speed, firing torpedoes and deck guns at point-blank range. When the smoke cleared, Ramage had sunk 4 ships and damaged 3 others. But more importantly, he had demonstrated that American submarines no longer feared Japanese surface forces. They were the hunters now, and the entire Japanese merchant marine had become their prey. The psychological transformation was complete. American submariners who had entered the war as reluctant warriors emerged as cold-blooded killers who measured success in tons of enemy shipping sent to the bottom. They developed a professional detachment that would have horrified their peacetime selves. Japanese merchant sailors weren't enemies to be fought honorably. They were targets to be eliminated efficiently. Commander Eugene Fluckey embodied this transformation perfectly. The man who would become known as Lucky Fluckey approached submarine warfare like a chess master, thinking 3 moves ahead of his Japanese opponents. He studied shipping patterns, analyzed convoy routes, and positioned his submarine not where Japanese ships were, but where they would be. In December 1944, Fluckey took the USS Barb into the East China Sea and proceeded to rewrite the rules of submarine warfare. He didn't just attack ships at sea, he followed them into harbors, penetrated heavily defended anchorages, and sank them at their moorings. When the Japanese moved their ships to shallow coastal waters where submarines supposedly couldn't operate, Fluckey took his boat into waters so shallow that his periscope nearly scraped the bottom. The Japanese had no answer for this level of aggression. Their anti-submarine tactics assumed American commanders would follow established naval doctrine. They never imagined facing submariners who would surface in broad daylight to shell coastal installations or penetrate minefields that were supposed to be impenetrable. But the most devastating innovation came from an unlikely source. Commander Charles Lockwood, commanding Pacific Fleet submarines, realized that American boats were operating in a target-rich environment with unlimited opportunities. The problem wasn't finding Japanese ships to sink, it was having enough torpedoes to sink them all. The solution was elegantly simple and utterly ruthless. Instead of trying to sink every ship they encountered, American submarines began targeting the most valuable vessels first. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies received priority over cargo ships carrying rice. Ammunition ships took precedence over troop transports. The goal wasn't just to sink Japanese shipping, but to eliminate the most critical supplies first. This strategic targeting had a cascading effect throughout the Japanese Empire. Without fuel oil, the Japanese combined fleet became a collection of expensive anchored monuments. Without ammunition, Japanese garrisons across the Pacific ran short of shells and bullets. Without food imports, the Japanese home islands began experiencing genuine hunger for the first time since the medieval period. The isolation was becoming complete. Japanese soldiers on bypassed Pacific islands found themselves cut off from resupply, slowly starving as American submarines picked off any ship brave enough to attempt a relief mission. The great Japanese fortress in the Pacific was becoming a prison, with American submarines as the jailers. Captain Dick O'Kane pushed this campaign to its ultimate expression during his final patrol aboard the USS Tang in October 1944. In the waters off Formosa, he encountered the largest Japanese convoy of the war. 24 merchant ships protected by destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft. Any rational submarine commander would have reported the convoy's position and withdrawn to safety. O'Kane attacked immediately. For 3 days and nights, the Tang stalked the convoy like a wolf hunting a herd of sheep. O'Kane picked off stragglers, ambushed ships that broke formation, and systematically destroyed the convoy's protective screen. When Japanese destroyers closed in for the kill, he dove deep and used the convoy's own ships as shields. By the time it was over, O'Kane had sunk or damaged over half the convoy. The Tang herself was finally sunk by one of her own torpedoes that ran in a circle, but O'Kane had proven that a single American submarine could neutralize an entire Japanese fleet if commanded with sufficient ruthlessness. The Japanese merchant marine was in free fall. Ships that had once carried the wealth of conquered Asia to Japan now lay scattered across the Pacific floor. Experienced captains refused to take their vessels beyond sight of land. Crews deserted rather than face another voyage through waters patrolled by American submarines. Japan's industrial production statistics tell the story with mathematical precision. Steel production dropped by 60%. Aircraft manufacturing fell by 75%. Ammunition production virtually ceased as raw materials stopped arriving from overseas territories. The Japanese war machine was grinding to a halt, not from direct attack, but from systematic starvation. But the American submarine campaign was about to reach its climactic phase. In early 1945, with Japan's merchant fleet reduced to scattered remnants, American submarines began the final strangling of the Japanese Empire. They moved their operations into Japanese home waters, hunting the last remaining ships within sight of Mount Fuji itself. The hunters had become apex predators, and their prey was running out of places to hide. What happened next would demonstrate just how completely American submarines had transformed the Pacific War from a contest between surface fleets into an underwater massacre that left Japan defenseless and starving. The final phase of Japan's destruction began with a single submarine slipping through the Tsugaru Strait under cover of darkness. Commander Eugene Fluckey had brought the USS Barb into the most heavily defended waters in the Japanese Empire, threading through minefields and patrol boats to reach the sacred hunting grounds that no American submarine had dared enter before. This wasn't just another patrol. This was the beginning of the end for Japan itself. The home islands, protected by centuries of oceanic isolation, were about to discover that their natural moat had become a killing ground for American submarines operating with absolute impunity. Fluckey's target wasn't some distant convoy or isolated transport. He was hunting the Karafuto Maru, a massive ferry carrying 2,400 Japanese civilians and soldiers between the home islands. The ship represented everything Japan still believed it could protect: families fleeing the advancing Soviets, wounded veterans returning home, children who had never seen war except in propaganda posters. None of that mattered to Fluckey. The Karafuto Maru was a legitimate military target carrying enemy personnel, and the USS Barb had 4 torpedoes with her name written on them. The attack came at dawn on August 22, 1945. Fluckey's torpedoes struck the ferry amidships, breaking her back and sending her to the bottom in less than 4 minutes. Over 600 Japanese died in the icy waters, including dozens of children whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of the Pacific War. But here's what made this sinking absolutely extraordinary. It happened 6 days after Japan had already surrendered. The war was officially over, yet American submarines were still hunting Japanese ships like sharks in a feeding frenzy. The killing had developed its own momentum that couldn't be stopped even by imperial decree. The psychological impact on Japan was devastating. Their emperor had surrendered. Their cities lay in ruins. Yet American submarines continued prowling their coastal waters like mechanical sharks. The message was unmistakable. Japan wasn't just defeated, they were completely helpless. Their island fortress had become an American hunting preserve. Lieutenant Commander William Thompson of the USS Tigrone epitomized this final phase of submarine warfare. In the weeks before Japan's surrender, he took his boat into Tokyo Bay itself, surfacing within sight of the Imperial Palace to shell coastal installations. Japanese civilians watching from shore couldn't believe what they were seeing. An enemy submarine operating with casual arrogance in waters that should have been absolutely secure. The numbers from this final campaign are staggering. In the last 6 months of the war, American submarines sank over 400 Japanese vessels, totaling more than 800,000 tons. But these weren't the massive cargo ships of earlier campaigns. These were fishing boats, coastal ferries, small cargo vessels trying to move supplies between the home islands. Japan was being murdered, one small ship at a time. Commander James Blanchard of the USS Albacore understood the strategic implications better than most. His patrol reports from early 1945 read like the observations of a scientist studying the death of an ecosystem. Japanese shipping had become so sparse that his submarine could patrol for days without finding a target worth a torpedo. The merchant marine that had once fed an empire had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in shallow coastal waters. The Japanese tried everything to keep their remaining ships alive. They painted hospital markings on cargo vessels, hoping American submarines would respect international law. They moved supplies by night in small boats that hugged the coastline. They even attempted to disguise warships as hospital ships, fishing vessels, anything that might avoid attracting submarine attention. Nothing worked. American submarine commanders had spent 3 years learning to identify Japanese deception tactics. They could spot a disguised warship from miles away, distinguish between legitimate hospital ships and military transports, track coastal shipping patterns with mathematical precision. The hunter-killer teams had evolved into something approaching perfection. They operated with the cold efficiency of industrial machinery, processing Japanese shipping through a mechanical death system that left no room for mercy or mistake. Captain Roy Benson of the USS Trigger demonstrated this evolution during his final patrol in March 1945. Instead of hunting individual ships, he positioned his submarine along the main shipping route between Korea and Japan and simply waited. For 12 days, the Trigger remained submerged in the same position, methodically destroying every vessel that passed through Benson's killing zone. Cargo ships, tankers, fishing boats, military transports, even hospital ships that couldn't prove their legitimacy. Benson's crew developed a routine that resembled factory work more than naval combat. Identify target, calculate firing solution, launch torpedoes, dive to avoid counterattack. Surface to confirm kill, repeat process. By the time the Trigger returned to base, Benson had sunk 14 Japanese vessels without moving more than 5 miles from his original position. He had transformed submarine warfare into an assembly line for destroying enemy shipping. The Japanese home islands were experiencing genuine starvation for the first time in their recorded history. Rice imports from Korea had virtually ceased. Oil shipments from the conquered territories had stopped completely. Even fishing boats were being sunk by American submarines that could no longer distinguish between military and civilian targets because the distinction had become meaningless. Commander Morton Mumma of the USS Sailfish, captured the psychology of this final campaign in his patrol report from July 1945. "We are no longer fighting a war," he wrote. "We are conducting an extermination. The Japanese merchant marine has ceased to exist as an effective force. What remains are scattered survivors attempting to avoid inevitable destruction." The mathematical precision of American submarine warfare had reduced Japan to a collection of isolated islands slowly dying from industrial starvation. Their steel production had fallen to 15% of pre-war levels. Aircraft manufacturing had essentially stopped. Ammunition factories sat idle because the raw materials they needed lay at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. But the most devastating effect was psychological. The Japanese people had believed their island fortress was impregnable. They had trusted their navy to protect the sea lanes that connected them to their empire. They had assumed their technological superiority would overcome any enemy challenge. Instead, they discovered that American submarines had turned their protective ocean into a graveyard. Every ship that attempted to reach Japan faced almost certain destruction. Every cargo vessel that left port knew it was entering a hunting ground patrolled by predators that showed no mercy and followed no rules except efficiency. The great Japanese Empire of the Pacific, built on naval supremacy and oceanic conquest, was being systematically strangled by fewer than 300 American submarines operating with ruthless precision in waters the Japanese had once considered their private lake. When Emperor Hirohito finally surrendered in August 1945, Japan had lost over 8.5 million tons of merchant shipping to American submarines. That represented 85% of their pre-war cargo capacity. The island nation that had once controlled half the Pacific Ocean couldn't feed its own people or supply its own industries. The underwater war had accomplished what no surface fleet could achieve. It had transformed the mighty Japanese Empire into a starving collection of isolated islands, completely cut off from the resources they needed to continue fighting. American submarines had won the Pacific War not through glorious surface battles or heroic amphibious assaults, but through the patient, methodical destruction of Japan's ability to exist as an industrial power. They had proven that modern warfare wasn't about conquering territory or winning battles. It was about strangling your enemy's economy so completely that resistance becomes impossible. The submariners who accomplished this victory returned home as quiet heroes, their achievements overshadowed by the more visible exploits of aircraft carriers and marine divisions. But they had fundamentally changed naval warfare forever, proving that a small force of determined professionals could destroy an entire empire if they were willing to abandon every principle of civilized combat and fight with the cold efficiency of industrial machinery. The Pacific Ocean had become an American lake, patrolled by submarines that had learned to kill without conscience or hesitation. Japan's island fortress had become their prison, and the keys belonged to men who had transformed submarine warfare into the most devastating naval campaign in human history. The war ended not with the thunder of naval gunfire or the roar of aircraft engines, but with the silent efficiency of American submarines that had methodically strangled an empire beneath the waves. When the Japanese finally surrendered in August 1945, they weren't just defeated by atomic bombs or invasion threats. They were starving. Their merchant fleet lay scattered across the Pacific floor, their supply lines severed, their industrial capacity reduced to nothing. Lieutenant Commander Fluckey and his fellow submarine commanders had accomplished something unprecedented in military history. With fewer than 300 boats, they had destroyed over 8.5 million tons of enemy shipping and reduced the mighty Japanese Empire to isolated islands, slowly dying from starvation. They had proven that wars aren't won by the largest armies or the most advanced weapons, but by cutting the economic lifelines that keep nations alive. The men who fought this underwater campaign returned home as quiet heroes, their achievements overshadowed by more visible victories. But they had fundamentally changed warfare forever. They showed the world that a small force of professionals, operating with ruthless efficiency and absolute determination, could bring the most powerful empire to its knees. The Pacific War was won not on distant beaches or in carrier battles, but in the crushing depths of the ocean by men who understood that sometimes victory requires abandoning honor for effectiveness. The underwater war that strangled Japan remains the most devastating naval campaign in human history, and its lessons echo through every conflict that followed.